Hello and welcome back to Blind-Back Hobbies. Apologies for the delay in time between my last video and this one, but unfortunately the missus and me are, well, not really unfortunately, we're getting our house ready to move us and the cub to a new abode, so things have been a little bit up in the air, packing and painting and all those other joyous things. So something slightly different this time round. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be having a look at some brand new, well, brand new to me anyway, speed paint type paints. They're scale 75s, instant inks, and we shall unbox them and see how they come out. Right, let's get started and take a look at the box and see what's in it, and then we'll get the wrapping off and we'll start. Whoa, what's going off with the hands? What do you mean? Can't we at least try and achieve a modicum of believability? Look, we blew this episode's effects budget on Fred. That has to be about the most unconvincing purported supernatural event anybody's ever claimed to witness.
Mary loves Dick. Mary loves Dick.
Maybe not. Can we just get on with it, please?
Yes, get on with it!
Alright, I'm getting on with it. Right, first order of business, these are not instant inks, they're actually instant colours. So I stand corrected there. Right, let's have a look at the box and see what we've got in here. There are 8 colours in total, starting with zucchini skin, dead flesh, fairy blood, zombie skin, phoenix feather, human flesh, undead dragon, and finally phoenix egg. I decided to go for this one because it's a nice pastel sort of set and it's not the kind of colours that you usually get in this type of paint. Okay, let's start by getting the packaging off. Right, so just carefully take the plastic off and we'll have a look and see what we've got inside. This is literally the first time I've ever seen these on the inside of the box, so I've no idea what to expect. Although they are nice army painter style dropper boxes. When I shake and rattle them, you can feel that there's a ball bearing inside, which is always nice to keep everything mixed up. From the outside though, some of these do look like they're very similar colours. Nice light sort of goblin greeny colour there. Should be the phoenix feather. Then we've got the human flesh. That one's undead dragon. And then finally the egg, phoenix egg. There's a little bit of an instruction manual in here as well. Let's have a look at that. That's quite nice. Standard fare. Just a few examples of how to use the paints. Nice example there of a few paints being mixed as well. There's a few more of the colours on the back. Not sure what these miniatures are, but they're quite nice. One thing I did find is that upon taking off the cap, you actually have to cut yourself into the top of the lid, which I suppose is good for it not leaking or drying out while it's in the box, but a little bit of a pain to get into the actual thing without slicing too much of the top of the cap off, or using something sharp like a long needle to pierce it with. In order to test out these paints, I decided that I was going to use a pure white and apply it with a brush on a few miniatures, and zenithal highlight on a few miniatures themselves. So in true Blue Peter style, here's one I prepared earlier. I'm just going to start by spreading a little bit of the paint on each of these sticks stickers, just so there's a pure white background and we can see what the paint looks like. I'll try and make it pull at one end, just to see if there's any sort of contrast properties that you can see immediately before we get it on some 3D surfaces. To be fair, it is designed to work on 3D surfaces by sinking into the crevices and recesses of whatever it's put onto, and that should show up its shading qualities. For those who aren't aware, this is basically how all of these speed/contrast paints are designed to work, be it the Games Workshop contrast paint or the Army Paint and Speed paint or any of the other brands. The idea being that if you choose to, you can just use one layer and the dark recesses will have the majority of the paint seep into them, with a gradient getting lighter towards the top of the surface no matter where it lands. Of course, this said, they are quite versatile, and the other brands that I've used are quite capable of being thinned down and used in a similar way to an ink or a wash or a glaze, and they also go quite nicely, I've found, through the airbrush and cover quite well. So you're not limited to using them in one specific way. They're, as most paints out there, just another tool for you to use in whatever way you see fit, which is the best way I find personally to approach any new sort of hobby product. Okay, we'll just have a closer look at these and then we'll get on to the nitty-gritty of it. So we'll start off in the top left with the zucchini skin. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to not dilute this at all. This is the product directly out of the pot, straight onto a pallet, and then onto the Space Marine backpacks here. They've got a nice amount of detail, so they should work well for what we're trying to do. The way these usually work is you have to load up your brush with quite a bit of paint, which is not normal practice for most acrylic paints. They usually tell you to do a couple of thin layers. I'm going to go on to the dead flesh here, which is a kind of grey purple by the looks of it. But yeah, as I was saying, you load up your brush to get as much on there as possible so that it can really seep into the recesses and create those dark areas and shadows where you need them. Okay, we'll just get that one finished up. Then we'll move on to the fairy blood next, which is definitely a purple. Now, I must admit that first impressions of these paints, as I was using them, was that they weren't covering quite as nicely straight out of the pot as either the Games Workshop or the Speed Paints, which are the ones that Army Paint and Speed Paints, which are the ones that I'm used to using. This next one is a zombie skin, which is very, very similar to the Nurgle sort of putrid colour that Games Workshop provide. It's quite a nice colour, it's quite vibrant. And then we're onto the Phoenix Feather, which is the orange one. This one went on quite nicely. Usually I would thin down a contrast paint ever so slightly if I was putting it on with a brush. But as I said previously, I'm wanting to see exactly how this product behaves straight out of the bottle. We're on to human flesh now. This looks very similar to the Gilliman flesh. Now, these do seem to be taking a lot more paint to actually achieve coverage. We're on to the Undead Dragon, which is a sort of off green-grey. I do think some of these names don't quite fit. I would have said this was a little bit closer to Undead Flesh rather than Undead Dragon, but my opinion. Then we're on to finally the Phoenix Egg, which is again another sort of pinky flesh colour. I'd actually personally say, looking at these two, this is a little bit more of a realistic flesh colour than the human flesh. The human flesh looks a little too orange, in my opinion. Okay, we'll have a little bit of a closer look at these now. Missed some tiny areas on the top, but that's purely because I've been painting without moving the paper, and it was difficult for me to get the brush around. but you can more or less see how they've dried. Some of these are a matte finish and some of them are gloss. Now, it's supposed to be a matte finish on all of these. Some of these actually dried quite shiny, and so far this is showing a little bit of inconsistency, at least in this particular set. Okie doke. So let's see how they go through the airbrush. I've chosen a basic black, grey and white zenithal highlight, and the miniature I've chosen to use is a Ninja miniature. This is by Soda Pop Miniatures / Ninja Division, I believe they're known as now. It's an anime
Hello, everyone!
style chibi miniature, which in English, for those of you who aren't familiar, means shrunken down body, big head to make it look cute. And in absolutely no way utterly horrifying. My missus is in her 30s and she's still somehow into this type of thing. That's fine talk for a grey, balding Gen Xer still painting toy soldiers into his waning 40s. Moving swiftly on. So I'm going through the paints in exactly the same order that I went through before. So this is the zucchini skin. And much the same way that I didn't want to thin down or alter the paints at all when they were coming out of the pots for the brush test, I've decided to not alter the PSI and aperture on my airbrush too much, because with the paints I already use, I very rarely have to alter much. I can thin them down and I can still get airbrush paint through them. I can use contrast paints more or less straight out of the bottle and I don't have to adjust much. Very occasionally I'll have to adjust my PSI, and more often than not all I'll have to do is thin the paint a tiny bit and just alter the aperture on the needle on the actual gun itself. So I thought I'd use these exactly the same way that I use the other contrast paints that I use, which is basically straight into the gravity cup, and away we go, just to see if they react in the same sort of way. Now, the vast majority of these at the beginning, I actually had a lot of problem getting it to go through the airbrush. I had to thin some, and then I got a spider webbing effect. Those of you who've used an airbrush before might have encountered this, and it's usually when your paint's a little bit too thin. Now, I only used a tiny bit of the Vallejo paint thinner that I usually use, and it seemed to make it way too watery straight away, so I went from one extreme to the other, and I was just generally speaking having flow problems trying to get these to go through smoothly. It took a lot of work, and I didn't find that they were covering very nicely either. I had to keep going over areas. There were only really two colours, which was the Phoenix Egg and the Zombie Skin, that went through nicely. So going forward, if I'm planning on using these again with my airbrush, then what I'm going to have to do is what I don't usually have to do, but obviously different brands require different methods for using them. Going to have a look at adjusting the PSI on my compressor and or experimenting with thinning it to a reasonable consistency. Finding, as I mentioned before, these paints are just a little bit too thick and a little bit too matte. But they also didn't react well with the Vallejo airbrush thinner that I usually use. So I'm either going to have to restrict them to being put on with a brush and thin down, or I'm going to have to experiment with finding appropriate settings for my airbrush, which would be a slight inconvenience as the settings that I more or less keep on it all the time work perfectly well with most of the other paints that I use on a regular basis. Obviously, just a caveat that this doesn't necessarily mean that these are bad paints. They just behave differently to the paints that I'm used to using and require different treatment in order to get the best use out of them. This is all my own personal opinion. You may find that these paints are perfect for you, and others that I prefer may not be quite your cup of tea. At the end of the day, we all have our own favourite toys, and if I, for example, prefer masks to Centurions, that's just another opinion. In this case, a correct opinion.
I've had the same sensation myself.
It is the age of the monster machine. The biggest, the baddest, the meanest climbing beast known to man.
Apologies, somebody got distracted by a wave of 80s nostalgia and the fact that toys back then were actually good. Let's get back to it, shall we? I think we're just about there anyway. Okay, so let's have a look at the results, and we'll start with the zucchini skin, which is better known as a courgette this side of the pond. It's a nice colour. However, as with the vast majority of these paints, I've found that there's not a great deal of actual contrast, which sounds like a little bit of a contradiction in terms for contrast type paints. They just seem more like thick ink paints. The other issues I've found, as you'll probably notice as I'm going through all these miniatures, is that they didn't actually cover that well. So underneath the lip of each of these ninjas' hoods, you might see that there are actual gaps where the paint didn't reach the recess, which is the opposite of what you want to happen with a contrast paint. It's designed to find those recesses to create the gradient that you need to give the illusion of pre-made highlights. There were, however, a couple of nice colours as I went through them. The phoenix feather was nice, and the zombie skin. But as I mentioned previously, it's extremely similar to Games Workshop's contrast paint, Plague Bearer Flesh. And if I'm honest, I prefer that paint a great deal over this. The matte finish on all of these might have its uses going forward in the future if you need a matte finish for any specific purpose. Other than that, the major consideration that we've got for these paints would be the price. And now this particular set cost me $26.99 for a set of 8 paints. The bottle says that they're 17 millilitres. In all honesty, they look exactly the same size as any other sort of Vallejo or Army Painter dripper pots. I think what they're doing there is they're actually being honest about the fact that you're going to lose a mil worth paint because there's a ball bearing in there, whereas the Army Painter has a ball bearing in its contrast paints, but they still label theirs as 18 mil. Games Workshops are also 18 milliliter, so you're not really losing out on paint, in my opinion. I think they're just being honest with the fact that you're losing a tiny bit to that ball bearing. This set cost me $26.99 for 8 paints. On paper looks like a decent range, but a lot of these colours are extremely similar, so it's not a great set unless you're complementing some base colours that you already own. And then when we consider that that works out at £3.37 roughly per pot of paint, it's not a great deal of saving compared to, in particular, the Army Painter. It is cheaper than the Citadel colour, but that's to be expected, as they are the most expensive paints on the market, more or less. For example, the only Citadel colour contrast paint set I could find online was a set of 8. They had a better range of colours. That was £42.50, including postage. That works out at £5.32 roughly per pot of paint, so way cheaper than that. However, if you look at the Army Painter sets, the new version 2.0 speed paints, which are very nice to work with, you can get a set of 6 for £18, which is £3 per pot, which works out cheaper, obviously. Or if you wanted a larger set of 10, which includes a brush, I found those at £31.50, which works out at £3.15 a pot. Or you could consider it £3 a pot plus £1.50 for your brush, which, if you need the brush, might work out well. If not, then, you'd have to make your mind up which colours you wanted and if it were worth the extra brush for you. But in my opinion, these are not actually worth the extra price. I'd stick to Army Painter speed paint or contrast paints, although there are inconsistencies over both those ranges. They are good quality overall and much easier to achieve desired results more quickly. They're also more versatile. I may find a use for these in the future, but I don't plan on replacing my current contrast paints with these. For me, it's just not worth it. Overall, there were 4 standout paints, 2 that were really nice and 2 that weren't so nice. Of the 2 that weren't so great, the standouts were Dead Flesh, which just appeared to be a kind of muddy off-grey brown, didn't particularly resemble flesh, dead or otherwise, and the Fairy Blood. Now, the Fairy Blood was a very dark, ruddy purple. Now, purple can be a little bit finicky when it comes to contrast paints, but there are still some nice ones available out there. Of the 2 that were nice, the Zombie Skin, great looking putrid green, and the Phoenix Feather went on very nicely and smoothly and had nice vibrant colours. And of all of these paints, that one was the only one that appeared to actually act like a contrast or speed paint right out of the bottle without any mitigation from the user. Bearing in mind that this is a first impression, and some of you may think that I was being a little bit unfair by not thinning down the paints at all or not really doing that many adjustments to my airbrush. I did do some, just didn't want to push the range too far out of what I'd usually use. I can't really recommend these unless you are somebody who's an experienced painter already and wants to try out something new. You might find some use for something that might have a little bit more of a matte finish finish to it. That said, I would not recommend this to people who are new to contrast paint. There are cheaper and better ranges available, like the aforementioned, and they're much easier to use and or much more affordable. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed that. Please like and subscribe, it really helps me out, and we'll see you next time.